Thank you.
Let's take you now back to the Mackinac Policy Conference in the session, Quality Early Childhood Education for a Thriving Economy.
Words about
That's
how
great.
we see the
Thanks so
challenge
much.
Closing the skills gap, both in Detroit and across
State of
the
Michigan,
US.
right there, third from the bottom. But it's not just African American kids. Let me show you where white kids in Michigan sit. Right there. When you look across the grade levels and subjects at how Michigan kids are doing, what you see is that this state's stagnation, while other states are moving ahead, has meant your relative position has been slipping and slipping and slipping. When you look at all kids, for example, in fourth grade reading, back in 2003, Michigan ranked 28th. Today they rank 38th. When you look at African American kids, back in fourth grade math in 2003, ranked 37th. Today they rank 44th. Latinos in the fall here has been the most precipitous. Fourth grade math, Latinos in Michigan ranked 16th back in 2003. Today they rank 40th in the country. And for those of you in this room who think, well, we're well educated, we're more affluent, we can insulate our kids from that, take a look at your children. Their ranking is falling every bit as far as black kids, white kids, and Latino kids. And those, of course, are the statewide averages. What happens when you look underneath those averages? What about Detroit in particular? When you look across the country at our big cities, where's Detroit in fourth grade reading? Tied with Cleveland, bringing up the rear, substantially below both the average for all large cities and performance in places like Charlotte and Louisville. When you look at the data for African Americans in mathematics, where's Detroit? Below even Cleveland. Bottom in the country in performance. And the important thing for you to know, this is not just a Detroit problem. The reality is when you look at data across Michigan school districts, these are data for African American kids. African American kids in Saginaw, Ypsilanti, Grand Rapids, and many other school districts, all of those to the right there, are performing below African American kids in the city of Detroit. And the same is true for Latinos. For those of you who have in your mind that the problems in Michigan are all about Detroit, au contraire. Again, Latino youngsters in Grand Rapids, Battle Creek, and Pontiac perform lower than those in Detroit. And I know the favorite strategy here in the state of Michigan has been charters. Charters will fix our problems. I'm sorry, but not the way you're doing it today. So this is a look at regular school performance. Axis on the left shows percentage kids meeting standards. Axis on the right shows you percent of poverty. And what you see there is most of your schools are mostly doing what's predicted. That is, the more poor kids they have, the lower their performance. You need schools like the ones that are standing out on the top end there, right? Schools that are actually taking all of their kids to high levels of achievement. And the question is that what your charter schools are doing? Nope. Nope. That's what the data look like in mathematics. They don't look any different in reading. So not an answer by itself. Good schools are what you need regardless of governance. So what happens when you add all this together? Add your regular traditional public schools and your public charter schools. What do you have when you look at Michigan compared to other states? What you see very definitely is the state is low performing and low improving. You are, when you look at a quadrant, you're in the bottom red quartile, right? In terms of both performance and improvement. Not where you want to be in a country that is already, at best, performing in the middle of the pack in terms of other countries. So the question is, if that's where you are, and that is where you are, what can you do to actually break these patterns? In the next couple of minutes, I want to actually draw from a report that's sitting in front of you here. I am not the author of this report. The author are Amber and Sarah. Where are you guys? Can you at least raise your hands? These are the guys to whom you want to turn for more detail here. But I want to draw from what we're learning from the states that are actually in the green quartile, right? The high performing or high improving states. What can we learn from them? First, and this is a really important lesson, please don't accept the excuses you get. I know that the first conversation that you have with your local school system, or frankly, even your state school system, about why the numbers look so bad, You will hear the same thing we hear all the time. Well, what do you expect? Say the educators, the kids are poor, the parents don't care, they come to school without an adequate breakfast, they don't have enough books at home, they don't have a quiet place to study at home, they live in difficult neighborhoods. A whole set of reasons, in other words, that are always about the kids. Our question back to them, though, and it's a question you need to ask too, but is, wait a second here. If you're right that things like poverty or difficult home circumstances cause low achievement, if you're right that these things make low achievement inevitable, how then can it be that poor kids and kids of color are performing so high or gaining so much faster in some schools, some school districts, even some whole states? Tennessee, for example, in Tennessee, 10 years ago, African American kids performed in reading below African American kids here in the state of Michigan. But Tennessee has spent 10 years getting after that problem. And look at the progress they've made compared to the much smaller progress here in the state of Michigan. African Americans, again, started below in Tennessee. They're now performing about a half a grade level ahead of where your kids are, because they focused and you didn't. I showed you the declines in fourth grade reading here in the state of Michigan compared to other states. Look by contrast to the state of Florida. Very similar kids in many respects, but you look at their African American kids, while yours declined, theirs made almost 2 full grade levels of growth. Latinos there also made almost 2 full grade levels of growth. Again, they focused, not same focus here. Not just reading either. Take a look at the numbers for math. Again, you take a look at Michigan, that's the gold line there. Compare that to the line in Tennessee. And even more important, in Massachusetts, a state that 10 years ago was kind of middling performance. In fact, in the middle of the 1990s, they were right in the middle of the pack. But they got serious about it, and look at the difference. Now, in year after year in national tests, their kids lead the country. You can help. When people say, no, our kids are too poor, they really can't do this, point to these successes and press for similar results here. Yes, in fact, that may make you annoying, but my advice to you is be annoying. You really, this Michigan Nice thing, you got to get over that, right? The reality is you don't do your education leaders any favor by excusing or explaining away poor results. Good education leaders will use pressure from you to move further, faster. They'll use you as leverage, so push them. And frankly, bad education leaders, you just push out when you do that. So it's a double win. So please, be annoying. Second, this emphasis on investing in the early years is hugely important. Economists on the right, economists on the left, who agree on almost nothing else, agree on this thing. That is, for every additional dollar you put into quality pre-K education, you are going to save at least 7, some argue 17, later on in reducing the cost of remediation, of repeating grades, of incarceration, all that stuff. So investing early in high-quality programs is really important. That's why business leaders across the country have made this such a high priority. That's why the military, now those of you who don't know, mission readiness is all about military leaders in this country saying, we need to be investing in young children to act on this research. So who can you learn from on that? I told you about the red, so that's you down there in the low achieving, low gaining category. Let's pick from the green category to talk about who learned from, and that would be the state of Florida on this issue. So Florida got out ahead of you. Over 10 years ago, they decided to act on the research about 4-year-olds, and they created a universal voluntary pre-K program for 4-year-olds. Real emphasis on quality. But they knew they shouldn't stop there, right? So they invested very heavily in very high quality training in reading for their elementary teachers. So their elementary teachers are now considered to be the sort of best trained in reading in the country. I had a principal friend from New York who said, I'd put these teachers in Florida up against any in the country. They're that good. They also provide significant supports in those early years for struggling readers. And they also decided that while they were at it, they were not going to keep advancing kids through the grades. until they learn to read. Now, you've started down this path, and I couldn't be sort of more complimentary of the start you've made. Legislature and the governor made a very big start last year by investing the $65 million in an expansion of pre-K education, which added an additional 10,000 slots. You got then a early learning race to the top grant from the federal government. And now the governor has proposed, and we're hopeful that the legislature will enact an expansion of that this year as well. These are hugely important investments, and I really encourage you to stay the course. But I also encourage you to understand that early education, catching things early, is really important. But it is not like immunization. A lot of people think that if we just get the kids earlier, we can somehow prevent all these later school failure problems. Education is not like immunization. It's more like nutrition. We really need to get it right early on, but we need to keep getting it right. So worrying also about the quality of the schools the kids are going into is important as well. So you've had lots of arguments here in the state of Michigan about Common Core standards. I want to just go back to first principles here. You have had, as a state, definitions of what's good enough that are much lower than most other states. And what do we know from research? Kids they'll give you exactly what you ask from them. If you ask a little, they'll give you a little. If you ask a lot more, they'll give you a lot more. So the question is, how do you get out of that? And what a lot of states that are stuck in these low standards realize is there's protection in numbers. So state leaders and governors and business leaders came together and they worked really hard on a common set of standards. That's what the Common Core is all about. It's about finding a way to create higher standards that are worthy of us teaching to the most important things that kids need to be ready for post-secondary life. And that's what they've done with the Common Core. Why do we know how important that is? Well, one of the places where Michigan can learn from is the state of Massachusetts that started all this back in 1993. Massachusetts had the courage to set a very high bar for high school graduation. They created a test called the MCAS, and people were frightened to death because the first year they gave that test, only about 20% of the kids passed it. And kids of color, the pass rates were much lower. But they said, look, we're not going to back off like many states do. We're going to stick with this, but we're going to invest in our teachers. We're going to provide extra time for our kids. We're going to make sure the schools that have lots of poor kids get extra resources. We're going to add learning time. And we are really going to invest in improving the skills and knowledge of our teachers and their school principals. That made a very huge difference in the state of Massachusetts. As I said before, when they started all this, they were middle of the pack. Today, time after time after time, they lead the country and, frankly, leading the world in assessment results. I talked about their focus on teachers and the quality of that, and it is really important. You've started the work here, but it's really important that that work that the legislature has done now get finished. Why? Because over the last 15 years, there's been a lot of new research that has helped us understand that there are very big differences amongst our teachers in their ability to take kids wherever they are when they enter a school classroom and grow them over the course of that year. Some teachers consistently take kids who come in this level way up, and others of our teachers take them almost nowhere at all. You see that in these results from Dallas, similar results in Los Angeles. What we're finding in the Los Angeles study is that the top quarter of our teachers are actually producing about 6 months more learning during an academic year than teachers in the bottom quarter. So those are very big differences, and they matter for kids. Kids who have 3 strong teachers in a row literally soar no matter what their family background, where kids who have even 2 weak teachers in a row literally never recover. So there are very big differences amongst our teachers, but the reality is, in most parts of the country, we've been pretending that there aren't. Teachers draw their paychecks, get the same amount of money, regardless of whether they're producing huge gains or very little gains. and they get equal little support. So where can we learn from in looking at who's really changing that practice, who's acting on this research in a serious way? And that would be the state of Tennessee. I showed you before, started where you are, a little bit lower. They are not yet a high performer, but as you can see there, they are a very fast gainer and just about to pop into the high performing category because they know what Jim Hunt, the retired governor from North Carolina, used to say in North Carolina, yeah, we're low, but if we're number one in improvement, we will eventually be number one in achievement, and that's the focus that they have in Tennessee. Take a look at those results again for African American kids. So what was it that they did in Tennessee? First of all, they did what Massachusetts did. They picked a strategy and they stuck with it, right? So they started on the watch of a Democratic governor. It has continued, even accelerated on the watch of a Republican governor. And those two governors have actually worked together to build a politics that supports this effort. They picked strategies that research said mattered, especially a focus on teachers. When you look at the work in Tennessee around teacher effectiveness, it is really impressive. They know, for example, that teachers, in order to get better, need really honest feedback. So they trained more than 5,000 people, mostly principals, but also some expert teachers, to do those observations and to learn how to give teachers the kind of critical feedback they need to get better. But they also provided lots of supports for those teachers, and they've invested too, as they move into Common Core, they've invested in making sure that teachers have the supports that they need to do this right. So they put a fair amount of money, about $15 million last year, into Common Core support. They identified 700 teachers who had particularly strong learning gains, and they trained them to help train their other teachers. And more than 30,000 educators have received training from those teachers to help them with this Common Core implementation effort. They've also developed a data system that is the envy of many in the country, where teachers have sort of real-time data on who's struggling, who's not, so they can really calibrate their instruction appropriately. So really focusing hard. The work that you started in the legislature and here in Michigan is really strong, and it's got to get finished this year to really move this effort forward in the state of Michigan, to put you among the states that isn't just pretending that some teachers are better than others and that teachers are really important, but it is acting on that knowledge. So I really hope the legislature here will finish that work. One final lesson, though, from the high-performing and high-improvement states, and that is about minding the gaps in both opportunity and achievement that are leaving too many of your children and too many of our children nationally behind. Now, I know when people look at the data and they see gaps separating black students from white students or poor students from wealthy students, they say, yeah, well, what do you expect? Those kids arrived at school behind. And the truth of the matter is, there's some substance to that, right? In this country, every single year, there are a set of kids who arrive at school already behind. Sometimes that's because of poverty, sometimes that's because of language issues, sometimes that's a result of family issues. But the question is, okay, knowing that, how do we organize our educational system in this country in response to that? And what you learn when you look honestly at that question is that rather than organizing our educational system in this country to ameliorate that problem, that is, to give these kids who come in behind the extra strong start that they need to catch up fast, we do exactly the opposite. We've organized our educational system in this country not to ameliorate the challenges kids bring to school, but actually to exacerbate that. How do we do that? We do that very simply. We take the kids who come to school with less, and we turn around and give them less in school too. We spend less on their education. We actually expect less of them. We systematically teach some kids less than others. Even our highest achieving African American kids, for example, are less likely to be put in rigorous courses. But worst of all, we assign them disproportionately to our least well-educated, least experienced, and least effective teachers. And then when they don't perform so well on standardized tests, who do we blame it on? We blame the kids and their parents. We never, ever talk about what we did. These forces, these lessons are absolutely devastating. Kids who come to our doors about this much behind actually leave us about this much behind. The gap, in other words, that separates both poor kids from middle-class kids and kids of color from white kids actually grows wider and wider and wider the longer they remain with us in school. Those practices of giving some kids less than others, less rigor, less quality teaching, less in the way of expectations, those practices aren't good for kids, they're not good for our country, and they are decidedly not good for business. We're basically taking the rich diversity that should be our strategic advantage in the international economy, and we're systematically obliterating that advantage. Don't just stand by and watch that happen, even if these are not your personal children. Speak up, demand the data on all groups of kids, demand progress for all groups of kids. Just plain, please, be annoying. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Katie. That was wonderful. You've given us a lot to think about.
Okay.
And I think some things to talk about
Okay.
to try to get into with a little more detail. You talk about expectations and how we've set the expectations too low. How do we get to this place when we stopped expecting all kids to perform at a higher level?
Well, the truth of the matter is we never really expected all kids. It used to be that if teachers taught something and only sub-kids learned it, that was kind of okay. That was all we really expected. We had an economy, as you know, that required some people to be educated to give the orders and a whole set of other people to be educated only so much as they needed to take the orders. We don't have that economy anymore. So we're actually asking school systems to do what they've never done before. And so that's really, in the end, what this is all about.
So when you look at districts like Tennessee and Massachusetts, and they have kids coming to school, as you said,
Oh, yeah.
kids who are living in poverty who come to the door with significant issues, are they addressing these issues that come along with poverty, or are they saying, our goal is to educate you, and we just have to set some of these other issues to the side?
Yeah, it's a totally good question. Let me answer it in two ways. I don't think anybody who works these issues doesn't understand that we'd make a lot faster progress if we worked on both fronts simultaneously. But the question for educators in these states is, what's our role there? We could do what educators in some other places have done, and we could just say, well, you got to fix the poverty part, and once you do, we'll fix the school part. Or we can get serious about our role. Educators in these states have basically begun to understand is there's no fixing poverty in the end without fixing education, because you'll get at best a short-term solution. If you want a long-term solution, those of us who are educators need to do our part, which is to make sure that even kids who are still poor, whose families are still poor, have a way out.
The state is looking at additional investment in early education. We have some of the proponents who helped push that first investment here.
Good for you.
Bridge Magazine and the Center for Michigan, Phil Power and John Bebo. Is it just about additional money in early education, or do we really need to adjust how we're approaching educating kids in those early stages?
Yeah, it's a really important question. What most of us experienced, or we might have experienced for our own kids, was pre-K, which is mostly about play. Quality pre-K today is at least in part about play, but especially for poor children, that play needs to both be very deliberately organized, but also accompanied by really methodical development of, say, vocabulary and early math skills. So one of the things that separates low-income children in this country from upper-income children is the vocabulary they bring with them to school. And in fact, the gap at kindergarten is so big that it's really hard for elementary teachers to kind of close that gap. So our best pre-K programs today are organized so everything is about developing vocabulary. But that doesn't mean kids are sitting in rows at desks, studying vocabulary words. What it means is you'll be working, for example, on transportation terms. So the teacher will read a story that's about trucks and planes and cars, but they'll play with trucks and planes and cars. So everything sort of reinforces the development of that vocabulary so that when kids then enter kindergarten, they'll have the vocabulary they need so that when they begin reading, that actually the words make sense to them, and that's the important difference.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You spoke a lot about teacher effectiveness, and Michigan is going through the process of figuring out how we're going to approach that in the state. And I'm curious, first of all, how do you get everyone on the same page about what an effective program looks like so that educators have bought in, lawmakers have bought in, the community has bought into what that program actually should be looking like?
It's not an easy process, but one of the things that's been so interesting about the work here in Michigan is you've got about 130 organizations that have been a part of a coalition here, and that includes everything from the Michigan Education Association to some civil rights organizations and business organizations that basically concluded, come to agreement on the basics of a system. Right? That's about clear standards for what good teaching looks like. It's about what they call a rubric. It's kind of a framework for observing teachers in the classroom and giving them good feedback. It's about the use of assessment data, not to catch teachers on sort of are their kids proficient at the end of the year, but how much did they grow? And in many cases, you could also add really nice surveys of kids or of parents. So that's a pretty decent way of thinking about teaching, and I think Michigan's off to a good start in getting there.
And what I've gathered from your points about Tennessee is that there was also an investment in teacher training and teacher support and professional development.
Yes, and Tennessee's made two really smart investments. The first one was to say, whoa, all these principals are going to have to do their observations in classroom a lot better, and most of them really don't know how to do that. So they actually had a very intensive training for all of their principals. They actually had to be tested against expert observers to see whether they could actually match the observation. And if they couldn't, they actually couldn't still be a principal. So they took this very seriously. They said, principals, your work with teachers and helping them make better is so important that if you actually can't pass this hurdle, you can't still be a principal. So that's really serious. So they did a lot of work with principals. But then on the Common Core side, they've been very smart. They said, boy, these standards are a lot higher than our old standards were. There is no way if we just tell our teachers, yeah, here's a copy of the standards, teach to it, there's no way they're going to get there. So they identified their strongest teachers. They gave them extra training, and they did these really intensive workshops for teachers during the summer. So teachers had a lot of support. They've also provided lots of online modules, and the observations that principals are doing are also put online. So actually they can sit in the State Department of Ed and see across the various districts, ooh, our teachers are really struggling with this thing called asking higher order questions, which turns out lots of teachers struggle with. But that's really important in the Common Core because we don't want our kids just to have rote learning. We want them to be thinking. And so they can actually create new modules for that right away. So it's a really thoughtful process. Not perfect, nobody's perfect yet, but it's really serious and it's beginning to pay off.
I spoke with one of the education leaders in Massachusetts some time ago. And one of the things he said was in Massachusetts, and they've been doing this now for over 20 years.
93. Mm-hmm.
He said, we had to understand that there wasn't a magic bullet.
Right.
We had to choose a plan, invest in it, and stick with it. Mm-hmm. Do you agree with that assessment?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, the plan needs to be a smart plan,
right.
But that is absolutely true. One of the things that we do so often in education, we'll try something, It's sort of like you plant a new thing and then you pull it up before it has a chance to grow, and you say, whoops, didn't work. So we'll go on to the new thing. And this is a real problem in local school districts where the new superintendent comes in, says, okay, throw out all the old, we're going to have my stuff. And it makes teachers crazy. The reality is the quality of implementation is, in fact, the most important part of educational improvement. It's not necessarily the program itself, but it's how well you stick to the design. So states like Massachusetts have said, we're going to set this bar high. We're going to create a long run ramp, though. So, and we're going to stick with this year in and year out. And they did, and boy, has it paid off.
At the same time, and I'm sure the people in this room would share my feelings about this, we look at these numbers coming out of Michigan, and they're disturbing, startling. And so there is a sense of urgency that the needle needs to move very quickly for kids in this state. So while long-term, there can be a commitment to a model, we've got some short-term issues we have to deal with right now. So how do we balance that long-term vision with the short-term need?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very big challenge. It's usually by picking a couple of metrics to really work on and then just going at them. So you've started with an investment in early, in 4-year-olds. And you've got strong interest in working on sort of an on-ramp on strong reading skills. And boy, does that make sense. I mean, it is not a joke when they say the people who build prisons build them based on 3rd and 4th grade reading skills. So, I mean, it's really important that we get those things right. So focusing on carrying up from those 4-year-olds up to the 3rd and 4th grade and really working hard on reading and basic math skills then makes a lot of sense. You could also, I mean, there's a lot of effort here in Michigan to kind of undo the Michigan Merit Corps that's happening in the high schools. That's an insane idea. Just at a time when the economy is demanding more, we're going to actually ask less of kids? That's crazy. So working on making sure that that doesn't get undone would be another really important thing to focus on. You've also got really nice work going on here on dropouts. I mean, kids who drop out in today's economy are toast. So making sure that there is an all-out effort, and this means schools and community organizations, United Ways and others, we really got to own this issue because otherwise those kids have no kind of future. So we really got to make sure they stay in school and get at least some post-secondary credential.
I want to have some time for questions from the audience. If you have a question for Kati, please raise your hand. We have some microphones in the room. There's one right down front, and then we'll come to you over here. And please tell us your name and where you're from. Right over here? Yeah, there you go.
Hi, Katie. My name is Roger Blake. I'm with AT&T,
Hi,
and I'm on my local school board in Berkeley. And you talked about some best practices that Tennessee, Florida, other states are adopting. I'm sure you're somewhat familiar with the best practice funding that's available for Michigan students, right, or school districts in Michigan. And those best practices seem to change every year, and they also seem to be tied to things like, you know, are we doing competitive bidding properly, and are we doing, physical ed properly? Are we giving kids enough phys ed? There doesn't seem to be any data that really connects to how those best practices are making a difference in the classroom for kids. I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I'm certainly not familiar with how that fund is structured, but if it's structured in the way you're talking about, and I don't want to suggest that not doing your bidding properly isn't important, but if you're in, as Jennifer suggested, you're in an urgent situation. Your kids are falling behind at a time when other states are racing ahead of you. So I would think that you would want to focus any available extra dollars you have, and I realize that the latest revise of the budget doesn't look so good, but you want to focus every available dollars you had on a place you can move the needle on real skills and real learning for your kids and for those who are teaching them. So again, were I to have a discretionary pot here, I sure would be focusing much harder on the supports for teachers and supports in these early reading grades So you really begin to move those numbers. If kids don't get especially strong reading skills in those early grades, it is really hard to make that up. You can make it up later on, but it's going to cost you a lot more, so why not invest smartly?
There was a, okay, yes.
I'm Bruce Peterson from DT Energy, and I'm also chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Cranbrook Educational Community in Bloomfield Hills. Joel Klein yesterday talked about the role of technology in improving educational performance. I wonder if you have any comments or thoughts either on what Joel said yesterday or that topic.
I didn't hear what Joel said yesterday. I will tell you what his deputy said about 2 weeks ago, and that is, don't get overly infatuated with technology. That a poor teacher with a fancy tablet is just a more expensive poor teacher. So be careful about that. Again, I am a believer that technology can be a really powerful tool for high-quality teachers. It can help them be even better than they already are, but it is not a substitute for good teaching. So you want to be careful. You know, it's very easy for people to embrace technology as a kind of silver bullet. And I think the research, the jury's still out. Is this going to help us or is it going to hurt us? In the hands of great teachers, it will help. I've seen it. I mean, you go in classrooms where great teachers have extra technology. It's amazing to see what kids are capable of. But I've also seen the opposite, and I would not encourage you down that path.
So back to the whole Massachusetts approach, there is not a silver bullet. We'll come here, and then we have a question here, and there's also a gentleman down front.
Kathleen Alessandro, Director of Everybody Ready. Just a quick question. How many districts are there in Tennessee and Massachusetts?
Both of them have large numbers of districts. So this is not, Maryland's another big gainer. It has like 27. Delaware has like 17. But both Tennessee, I think Tennessee may have 600. I mean, it's a large number and lots of teeny ones like you do. So it is not an easy place to make change. You know, give me Delaware, Rhode Island, Maryland any day. But these high-gaining states have a lot of school districts.
Right here.
Good afternoon. Kimberly Dawn Wisdom, Henry Ford Health System. I have a couple of annoying issues to raise with you.
Sure.
Really enjoyed you sharing the information. But one concern that I have, in healthcare, we talk about there are social determinants of health,
Yep.
that health is not just what happens in the clinical setting,
Totally.
but health occurs where you live, learn, work, play, and pray.
Yeah.
And so this whole notion about social determinants of education, and as I hear these brilliant presentations from a lot of people across the country related to education of our children, I don't hear enough about health. And when I think about those social determinants, I mean, children are having problems breathing because the asthma rate is so high. The incidence and prevalence of asthma is so high in Detroit. They don't have the parental support. They're in violent home situations where there's that toxic stress. So the question is, how are we really looking at all those other elements that relate to health and actually, either promote health or could mitigate some of the education challenges? And so where are the parents and where does health come in this really, really important equation?
Sure. So I just finished my second round of being a commissioner on the Robert Wood Johnson Commission on Healthier Americas. So I certainly know plenty about how these things work together. And as a former vice president of Children's Defense Fund, I get this. But what I tried to say earlier in response to Jennifer's questions, and maybe I wasn't clear enough, is there's no question but that we would make faster progress, especially for our poorest kids, and especially for kids in communities of color, urban communities of color, if we addressed all of these things, right? So if we worked hard on income supports, right? If we raised the minimum wage, I mean, there are a lot of things we could do if we organized our communities so that parents had safe places to walk. I mean, there's a lot of things that need to happen. The question for me is, okay, so while those things are going forward, do we want our schools to just expect less of the kids because they're poor? Or do we want our schools to do what they can do, every bit of what they can do? Because what we're finding is schools are much more powerful in changing the life trajectories of kids than they ever know. So yes, we need to work on all these other things. And in my work, I work on all of them. But around the question of what do we want to happen in our classrooms, if we don't do that part right, none of what we do on the health side or the income side is going to have a permanent effect, right? There's no permanent route out of poverty in this economy without, frankly, a college education. So that's got to be a destiny in the heads of our teachers when they look at the kids in their classes.
As we're moving the mic, Katie, just to follow up to that,
Sure.
have schools been disempowered, or has the power in the classroom just not been fully realized?
Yeah, educators are taught, frankly, in schools of education, not to think they're very powerful, which is truly unfortunate because they're a lot more powerful than they know. And so a lot of what happens in quality schools is you have to break people of not thinking they can make a big enough difference. If educators come out of teacher prep or leader prep programs and they don't think they can make much of a difference, or even if they do think they can make a difference but they don't really have the skills that they need to do that. For example, there's been a recent report on classroom management. You would think that the bottom line is that our teacher prep programs should at least equip their teachers with a basic set of classroom management skills. If you can't manage a classroom, you're not going to be able to teach the kids anything. The vast majority of our teacher prep programs hardly do anything at all. Most new teachers have had no experience with classroom management. That's insane, right? And so when you don't have any tools at your disposal and you're not producing good results, even if you came into the classroom thinking you could make a difference, you end up just lowering your expectations because your skills aren't up to the job. So which is why when we talk about making sure we're investing in helping teachers to master the skills that they really need to take even kids from difficult circumstances to high levels of learning, that's really important because teachers who don't have the skills, even if they have the beliefs, will inevitably fall down.
We have time for just
Okay.
2 more quick questions.
Thank you. I'm Vaughn Washington. I'm with the Kalamazoo Promise. Thank you for being here.
Yeah.
This is no fair. And they'll attest to the fact that I was going to talk about classroom management. There's no doubt that's where I was going because as a principal for many years, that's where there was a blur in the line on whether or not someone knew content and whether they could deliver that as opposed to redirection because of classroom management issues. And so you spoke to that very much so. As far as teachers being empowered and schools being empowered, it probably is about time for us to leverage the school against the community resources. No fair students coming to school and having an opportunity, and I get to say this because as the steward of the Kalamazoo Promise, the scholarship program many are familiar with,
Right.
no fair students having a barrier removed, but their teeth are falling out of their head.
Yeah.
And that's what they have to focus on. No fair that they have a scholarship, but then they can't get to school. So starting to leverage that. So we leverage the scholarship often, but time for schools, we need to start leveraging this with the rest of our community in a collective impact strategy, which many people are doing. But thank you for addressing classroom management. This is huge. If we have to redirect all the time, then there are issues with delivering content. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's, just to make one more point on that, one of the things that those of you who work with data or work with school systems know is how often black boys are put into special ed programs. And when you actually look at what's going on there, often those referrals, those disproportionate referrals are coming from just a handful of teachers. And when you go in and you look at what's going on in those classrooms, it's nobody ever helped them to do basic classroom management. So what presents as a disability is actually something that a teacher who's skilled is not going to have any challenge with. And so this is, again, another reminder why both what happens in pre-service programs is important. You need a strategy there to make sure teachers are coming out as well prepared as they can. But boy, you need to provide supports on the in-service side as well. Otherwise, teachers will just come up against these challenges and inevitably then just back away.
You've been waiting very patiently. We've got just a couple of minutes.
Okay.
My name is Andy Meisner, and I'm a former legislator and current Oakland County Treasurer. But I want to really thank you for the data that you've presented, that I'm kind of going back and forth between anger and sadness, as I listen.
Yeah.
But you can't argue with the numbers. And, as a legislator, I tried to do kind of empirical-based policy. And it seems like the numbers on early childhood have been so clear for so long. This is just the latest kind of vivid illustration of how impactful good early childhood education is. And so I'm curious, what barriers do you think are out there that maybe aren't spoken in terms of really embracing, universal pre-K? And what specific strategies have you seen maybe in places like Tennessee and Florida to build political consensus around significant investment in, in this winning strategy that may not be a silver bullet, but from a policy perspective, to me, it's the closest thing to a silver bullet that we've got.
Yeah. Tennessee's not there yet, so I won't talk so much about Tennessee. In Florida, it was very much, what played out there is very much what's happened in other states. Bipartisan focus, a look at the research, a governor who actually wanted to lead on this issue, and a legislature that saw the numbers and really said we're going to go there. California, by contrast, though, shows the polar opposite. They tried to go universal, and what people said is, look, upper income families are already paying for this, so this is actually just a subsidy for them, and they lost on that ground. So this is an issue that you need to sort out sort of state by state. The data are overwhelmingly clear that this matters most for low-income kids. So you want to the extent that you can, focus there initially. That is absolutely the way to go, and it doesn't then raise all these other questions about are we just subsidizing rich parents and so on. From a quality perspective, you are better over the long run to have universal, because those well-to-do parents will fight to keep those programs and the dollars coming in, and the poor parents won't have the same political resources. So that's kind of one of the ways that people think about coalitions. But frankly, business and the military are the strongest allies on this issue now, and I would, I know that's what's happened here in Michigan, but using military leaders as well to make this case can be hugely useful. The other thing that gets in the way is the issue of who's going to provide it. So in places where you can just roll out sort of 4-year-olds just move into your school district programs, it's a fairly easy lift. In places where you've got multiple providers all fighting over who gets access to the dollars and who doesn't, the politics are more complex. So you have to sort of figure out how to go. I think you've got a smart strategy here with the kind of star rating system like North Carolina did, that will make sure that quality is a driver. But for sure, that's got to be the bottom line, is getting more kids in a pre-K program if there's no quality is a complete waste of money. So that's got to be the driver. What's the strategy to get the most kids, especially low-income kids, in a quality program as fast as you can? And that's going to vary a bit from state to state.
Katie, just in the final minute you have the collective ears of lawmakers, former lawmakers, members of the business and foundation communities, the media. If we only remember one thing from this session once we leave the island, what is the most important thing we take away?
I'm gonna suggest two. One is you're on the right track, both on the early learning and the teacher stuff, but it's really important to follow it through and to stick with it. So that's huge. The second part is that you gotta be annoying. You gotta get over this Michigan nice thing. You gotta really say, it's not okay for Michigan to be slipping backwards when other states are moving forward. And the more voices that say that, the more likely you are to get movement. And make sure you say it not just on behalf of your personal children, but on all Michigan kids. Because with this state's demography, unless you're making progress for all groups of kids, you got no future at all.
Many thanks to the W.K. Kellogg Foundation for their support of this conference and of this session. And of course, many thanks to you, Kati Haycock. It's been a pleasure.
No, it's fun. Thank you.